So the piece that I want to kind of quickly go over is a work that I recently did. It's called First Life, Imagining the Chemical Origins of Life. What this was a piece that I wrote for a string quartet for live audio and live video, and with some audience participation. This was a piece that I wrote based upon a grant from a center that is funded by the National Science Foundation and NASA, which is the Center for Chemical Evolution. And what I did, I worked with a biochemist at Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta and took data from her research lab and then tried to turn that into information for the string quartet and for the live audio and video. So here are the procedures that I went through in trying to do this kind of sonification, for example. The first thing was to collect all the data. So what I got from this research lab was information on how monomers and polymers, oligomers, peptides, and amino acids self-organize. What the Center for Chemical Evolution is trying to understand is there a chemical basis for the formation of organic compounds, which are at the basis for life. So what her modeling was doing at the Martha Grover lab at Georgia Tech was trying to sort of create probabilistic formulas to see, are there certain conditions where certain of these formations would start to self-organize into more complex organizations. So I was looking at that data, trying to collect all that data, and then you can see here the protein data bank would give me information about how that works, and then you can see a visualization that I was able to do from that. This was done in what's called PyMol, which is a version of Python visualization language. And then from that, here's another example of a particular kind of construct that is used in amyloid beta research on a certain kind of Alzheimer's proteins that are found. And you can start to see within those visualizations, we start to see certain structures of sound that could be modeled into both visualization and then, but how do we turn those particular models into sound, and the relationships of these particular kind of proteins, how would we turn that into something where the listener could be perceiving something of the inherent structure of these models, and that's somewhat the goal in that. So the next phase of the composition is to have the data-driven composition, where I would create a way of extracting the data and having it turned into parameters of sound. So I did this with a number of objects. The MaxMSP was a program that I used. I also was able to extract in MaxMSP, they have something called Open Sound Control, which we'll talk about in this class, which allows us to then send that data through a certain kind of format, and it can be listened to or perceived by other different software programs. So here is a quick patch that I had set up in MaxMSP where the data is coming in, and then what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to route that data into a physical model of a violin. So the physical model of the violin, you can see here the data is going to be determining the bow rate, the sort of the speed of the bow. It'll be determining the position of the bow, whether the bow would be moving closer to the bridge or to the fingerboard, how much reverb I put on the sound, whether the sound is positioned in a stereo space, whether it gets panned left or right. So each data stream of information that I'm taking, I'm trying to map that into something of a violin performance that we would hear those parameters change according to that. Here's the data stream, for example, that I took off of some of that. You can start to see there were, in this case, there were 4 different data streams that would be mapping to those parameters that I just talked about. Here's another example where I took the sort of 20 amino acids, and I started to take the 4 that were found in the constructs I was looking at. How do I take those amino acids and then do some parameter mapping? So I take each amino acid and try to find some way of turning that into a different scale, a different kind of density or bow rate on the violin. So each of the things that were going on in the data, in the biological constructs, I was trying to then find a way of mapping that into some kind of sonic parameter. So here you can see there were 8 polymer chains in the constructs I was looking at. So I then tried to come up with 8 what are called pitch classes. This would be different pitch sets that the material would be drawn from. And there you see the relationship of those scales or pitch classes that the material was deriving. From that, I routed it into another system, which we'll introduce you to later, called Kima. Kima is a sound design system which allows me then, you see here these variables on, I've got probably 9 or 10 different variables on this physical modeling violin sound that I could have control over. But each of those slide faders that you see on the screen, I could map into one of the streams of data coming in. So that way I could keep trying to assign the various changes in the data into something that we would actually hear in the violin changes in this physical modeling in Kima. The other thing I wanted to do in this work was try to have some relationship between the audience and the performers so that the audience feel like they are contributing data into this construct. So you see here what I did on this was use a popular game controller, the Microsoft Xbox Kinect. And I had two Kinects. I had one set up to capture the movement and the energy from the audience, and the other one is set up, and you see on the string quartet. So both of those was sending data from the Kinect that I could take different movement points off that information as another data string coming into the composition. So that was an important part of making the audience feel like they are part of this data stream composition. And then you see here, this is a particular kind of notation program called Notability Pro, which allows for me to put markers into the notation of the score for the string quartet, so that as the string quartet plays, those particular markers can also be sending particular data, either MIDI data or open sound control data that can be triggering information. So with all of that, when I then start to think, what are the different ways on a violin, for example, that I could map data onto a string instrument? And here you see there are probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 different variables that I could decide to map my data. So on a string instrument, you could have the qualitative aspects. You could have the kind of string is important. Is it a small string, a thick string? Is the string metal? Is it made of different kind of plastic material? So all of that can be mapped into a variable. The resonating body of the instrument is important. The bow and the bow hair. Many violinists will spend a great deal of money to buy a very expensive bow because that bow will determine the quality of the sound. So can I have some variable over those, the bow quality, and have a data mapping to that? The motion of the bow is a big part of what a violinist does. So the amount of pressure, the speed, the angle of tilt of the bow on the string, whether it's up bow or down bow, how they articulate. Is it spiccato or détaché, or the various different ways that they can do the bowing technique are important. The envelope shape, do they swell into the note? Do they articulate it very quickly with a sharp attack? And here again, do they place near the fingerboard or near the bridge for a different kind of quality of sound? You can also have linear choices that we have to map. The violinist will choose to do whether vibrato or not, or whether they choose to play on the G string or the D string. How much portamento, the sliding between pitches that a violinist will do. And then how much kinesthetic and sort of cognitive activity is going on. Many violinists will put lots of physical energy into their performing of the body. Can we map that through data? Can the image that the artist has when they're playing the instrument, whether they have some emotional cognitive content, will affect all of those parameters. So all this to show that when we think about the relationship of sonification or data mapping, something as just one violin, there are probably 15 or 20 different decisions that are going on in a performer where I could decide to have a relationship of the data that could be affecting those decisions. Okay, so what I want to do is play a couple examples of excerpts from this composition. So the excerpts that you'll be listening to, these are in some ways realizations of the data coming off the biochemical information mapped to various sonic parameters. So I did not determine what this is going to sound like. This was something that had a probability function, and we're listening to where I set up, as I showed you, the scales, the kind of pitch class sets that will be used in this, and then the parameters for how the sound changes are, but I did not determine what this is going to sound like. So in that excerpt, the density, how many notes per second, and then there was a range of variables in that. So I didn't really understand when I wrote this what kind of texture would be creating in this. I was creating kind of density of how much information would be coming in per second. I had certain filters built into that, so that the piece that was created was certain scales that I determined, but I didn't understand the ordering of those scales. There were physical sounds that were built in from the data, but also the sort of melodic aspects were something that I had no control over as well. So in some ways, this kind of gives you a way to build an algorithm, a kind of a process for the data can represent certain parameters of the sound without determining and controlling that. Here's a second example of from the same composition. So on that one, you could see that was a algorithm where the parameters were mapped to a synthesis process. So it wasn't trying to be a physical modeling, it was trying to be purely electronically generated sounds with different kind of granular synthesis patches built into that. So a very different kind of sonic result. But here again, the similar data, as you could see, the visualization that I was showing was the visualization of that same data, where you could see these chemical elements starting to self-organize and to cluster into polymers. So that's where the sound was being generated off that same information. And then finally, a third example of a different kind of texture off the same data. And on this example, you will be able to see the patch. I show the patch a little bit in the performance on this of how it operated, and you can see the data streaming into it. So, sonification or data-driven composition is another way of thinking about sound design, where we start to utilize the fact that this is a digital sound design. The fact that we have digital means that we have to utilize the entire power of what the computer or the digital world brings to us as sound designers. So the computer is being used in all sorts of interesting ways to really capitalize on the benefit of that instrument. And it opens up new ways of thinking about sound. And as designers, we can now start to explore and utilize the tools and the power of those kind of design parameters that the computer offers us to open up new sonic possibilities of sound, just as the composers did in the 1950s when they first started using the computer, or people, Stockhausen and other people who started to work with electronic composition started to explore synthesis as a new sonic world possibility. So I hope that you will start to look at some of these possibilities that algorithmic composition and sonification offer you, and open up your own sonic possibilities.